Hi, I'm Urmi Desai, editor of MoveSmartly.com, and this is the Move Smartly Show. This week, our episode is another session of our Move Smartly Ideas segment, where we take a deeper dive into housing economics and policy issues. Today, John and I are talking to Paul Kershaw. Paul is a public policy professor at the University of British Columbia, UBC, School of Population and Public Health. And he is the founder of Generation Squeeze, a think tank that researches and advocates for today's working age and younger generations. Paul's work with Generation Squeeze has strongly focused on major areas of Canadian life, including housing and social security programs, which Generation Squeeze feels disproportionately financially advantages older generations, those approaching retirement age and past it, at the expense of younger ones. Today, we'll dig into what Generation Squeeze feels that Canada needs to do differently, specifically about its housing market, and touch a bit on its other policy proposals as well to ensure more fairness across generations. I really enjoyed our discussion with Paul. It was lively and interesting because Paul doesn't shy away from making bold policy proposals. So I enjoyed that, and I hope you will too. As always, if you enjoy listening and watching our show, please subscribe, like, share, review, and do what you can to help us spread the word about our show. As always, we appreciate your support. Thank you. And now, on to the show. Great. So we're so excited to have with us today Paul joining our show. Paul represents, as I've mentioned in my introduction, Generation Squeeze. Paul, I thought to start, I'd have you explain a little bit about your work. You're a UBC professor, but you're most well known for your leadership of a group called Generation Squeeze. I see on the website, it's not just a think tank, it's a think and change tank. And I've also read elsewhere that it's been modeled on CARP, or the Canadian Association of Retired
Oh, yeah.
Persons. So that advocacy group for that generation, and your advocacy group is advocating for a younger generation. So maybe a little bit of background on that.
Yeah, great. So I am a prof at UBC, and one of the things I learned relatively early on in my career as a professor is that evidence is only one factor that influences public policy, and it has to compete with a range of other ideas, some of which are fake news. It has to compete with the momentum that institutions already have. It has to compete with interest groups, and so political science is really clear that if you want to mobilize evidence into action as an academic, you need to think like a movement. You need to think like a lobbyist. You need to think like a marketer. And if you're doing all that, you're probably thinking like a political scientist. So, some years into my career at UBC, concerned about what was happening for younger generations, like, we have to not just be a think tank, we need to be a think and change tank, and the change tank can bring in some of those skills of thinking like a movement marketer and lobbyist. And when we were looking for inspiration, it's true, there has been a long-standing lobby for seniors called the Canadian Association of Retired Persons. It's one of the biggest interest groups in the country, and it's effective. It does a strong job at representing the perspectives of an older demographic. Gosh, I just turned 50, so sooner than later I'm going to be part of that. And I want to get it right for my mom and my other older family members, so we kind of admired their work, and we're like, oh, there's no corresponding viewpoint representing the interests of a younger generation. And that imbalance in representation is part of the systemic problem. So we tried to fill that in part with Generation Squeeze. And that was really sort of, I would say, our version 1.0, maybe 2.0. We're definitely Gen Squeeze at least 3.0 right now. And by that, I mean, like, the vision we have for Canada One is really one that works for all generations. It's about intergenerational solidarity, and increasingly is inviting an older demographic to recognize that we want to leave a legacy of which we're proud. We want to leave a healthy childhood, a healthy home, a healthy planet for those who follow. And that really is the core mission of Gen Squeeze.
Great. Thanks, Paul. I would ask everyone, all our listeners and viewers, to go to gensqueeze.ca to look at the platforms, which are laid out in quite a lot of detail. For our show, I wanted to jump right into, your housing platform, because it's quite detailed and laid out on your website along the lines of several pillars. So what I
Yes.
thought for the framework of our discussion or chat today, I would just dive into some of the pillars. And I wanted to start with pillar 3
Oh,
because
that's by far the most interesting pillar.
yes, it's most interesting. And as your website says, the one that you're most focused on, and it has the title Breaking the Addiction to High Home Values. So, as a prescription for Canadian public policy, that is a wowza, I think, to start.
Yeah, definitely.
And so let's start right into some of the particular policy points that you're making under this, I guess, this pillar. So first, Paul, you meant the Gen Squeeze mentions that Canada needs to rely less on real estate to drive economic growth. And under this is one of the big stats that the document states is real estate contributes to 14% of GDP, but only to 2% of employment. Now, first question, this looks a bit low to me. I've seen figures that put this at 20% of GDP, but I wonder if that includes construction jobs. So I'm wondering how you're arriving at those figures. Let's start with that first. And then the second part to the question is why you think this mismatch is so important.
Yeah, great question. So you're an insider to the industry, and if you get the 20% figure of GDP, if you were putting together construction, which is about 6, 7, 8%, I didn't actually prepare for that stat today, but I absolutely am sure that real estate rental and leasing adds up to about 14%. So when you put those two things together, that gets you to 20. I focus on the real estate rental and leasing because construction is its own industrial category, and the proportion of GDP and the proportion of employment are relatively similar, which is what you'd kind of want to see. If you're going to be driving about 6 to 8% of GDP, let's hope that you're also then driving out 6 to 8% of people's livelihoods. But when it comes to real estate rental and leasing, we see this big portion of GDP and relatively few people are making their livelihoods there. That should be an alarm bell for us. The only place where we see something at all similar is actually from oil and mining and gas, where it's actually about 8, 9% of GDP. Again, people can fact check this. I didn't prepare for this stat today, but it's in that order of magnitude. And you have, a few percent of people making their livelihoods there. People often describe those industries as being extractive. We're extracting, the planet's resources. And what I think is so interesting is we should bring that same language over to, the way in which housing is contributing to our GDP in a way that is extractive. I'll get to that in a moment. But the gap between 14% of GDP, about 2% of employment, people making their livelihood. Here's what it means for the way we grow our economy. We grow the major cost of living, housing. That the small number of people who work in that industry, often real estate agents, they'll make good livelihoods. Good on them. Homeowners like me, we will get wealth windfalls as the value of our asset rises. But everybody else who isn't in those two categories is going to start to have their standard of living decline because it's going to take more work to cover paying for their major cost of living. It's one way to grow the economy, but if you really care about productivity, what you would want ultimately is to say, well, hey, when Canadians borrow, they're going to go borrow and they're going to invest in parts of our economy that drive employment, that drive productivity, that drive technological change. They're going to make us greener. But what we do in Canada disproportionately, we borrow money and then we bid up the cost of something that already exists. We don't make the roof better. We don't make the kitchen better. We don't make the floors nicer. We just bid up the cost of those things. And that has been a dominant way, starting in British Columbia initially, because that's where 20% of GDP is real estate rental and leasing. And then we kind of spread the contagion of this sort of lazy approach to economic growth elsewhere across the country. And now it's quite an infliction. And so I would much, much prefer if government policy incentivized us to borrow and invest outside of buildings that already exist, although clearly we need new supply. So we do want to channel investment to build new supply. That's different than borrowing to bid up the price of something that already exists.
Now, Paul, thousands of real estate agents and flippers around the country are going to say granite countertops in kitchens are an improvement. But I'm going to
sure. But the granite countertops already exist at the point of sale, and we just have more and more people.
More and more granite. John, I'm wondering what your take is on this stat and this argument.
Yeah, I guess as you brought it up, I think one question I had and I wasn't sure on is that, the 14%, if I'm not mistaken, a big part of that is the like the theoretical rent that homeowners would pay for their home, which, we call imputed rent. So it's not really, I mean, obviously it's not an industry. Obviously, no one is employed when we think about the theoretical rent I pay or every homeowner pays. So I guess my question is that a problem? Like this is just, it seems like it's an accounting thing that the federal government looks at every homeowner's property. They think about what their theoretical rent would be. We kind of add that to the GDP, but it doesn't mean that's necessarily driving our economy. And I think that maybe that explains the mismatch between labor and that portion of GDP, unless I'm missing it.
Yeah. Well, now we're getting super technical, and let's not lose everybody all at once. So let's bring it up
Sure.
one level of aggregation here and say, look, when governments judge whether or not they're being good economic managers, they're going to point to GDP. When people critical of governments are going to judge whether or not they're being good economic managers, they're going to point to GDP. When GDP goes up, we're going to assume, oh, decent management of the economy. When GDP goes slower, stalls, maybe goes into it, then we're like, oh, we're worried. My point is, if the biggest thing driving GDP is really the value of residences, we should take that as yet one more signal that GDP is only one and not necessarily the best measure of prosperity.
Mhm.
Because if we are driving up the major cost of living without driving jobs and productivity and income increases to go hand in hand, we are actually eroding for many people, especially those who are not homeowners in Ontario and BC in particular, but in cities across the country. We're eroding the payoff from hard work. And I think that my call to Canadians from this sort of generational perspective is that we've been to this horror show now for some decades, and we should understand why we tolerated it for so long. People like me, and those especially who came before me, like baby boomers, my mom's generation is sort of the oldest of the boomers. We transformed having a mortgage and paying our mortgage off and going from debt holder to asset owner into, not only do I want to pay my mortgage off, I want my home to double. I want it to triple in value. I want it to be the windfall wealth accumulation strategy. But if we are relying on housing to deliver for Canadians a disproportionate share of our wealth accumulation and savings for the future, by definition, we are going to be inflicting unaffordability on those who follow in our footsteps. And that's what we've witnessed over the last decades. One generation's wealth windfall has come at the expense of the kids and grandchildren they love. And that is the tension that we need to be breaking. Hence, you'll see in the Gen Squeeze plan to restore housing affordability forever. What's the big part of our project needs to be breaking Canada's cultural addiction to relying on high and rising home prices. Whether to say I'm a good economic manager as a politician, or whether as a regular person thinking about how I'm going to prepare for retirement down the road. Because if we over extract wealth at this moment from the housing system, mathematically, we are leaving less affordability for those who follow in our footsteps. And I think that's the primary challenge we're all grappling with right now. And I don't think anyone did it intentionally. It's not an individual problem, it's a systems problem. And Gen Squeeze is trying to help us recognize this systemic problem, see who's disproportionately being harmed, and then in a provocative way, we do invite those who have benefited to say, hey, how can we lean in to being a bigger part of the solution? How can those of us like me, I've gained, full disclosure, $1.5 million in my single detached home in Metro Vancouver over the last couple of decades. I'm on the record about this all the time. Over that same period of time, I've been a professor at UBC. That's a good paid job. I have a defined contribution pension. Not everyone does. But over that 20 years of my contributing and my employer contributing, I have about $700,000 of equity in that defined contribution. Over the same time period, my house has made me twice as more wealthy than that, $1.5 million bucks. That's a dicey dynamic for how society is planning for wealth accumulation. We are, by definition, inflicting a lot of unaffordability on those who follow if that's our approach to saving for wealth and retirement.
I like your style, Paul. All the cards on the table. I do like that. And I appreciate that. We are not afraid of wonkish wonkish details here. So we're going to dive further into one of the other reasons.
Oh, are you going to take us into how we measure housing inflation?
Yes, because
I love your show. Let's do it.
because this is a discussion that John, from his expertise, has also weighed in on. So one of the issues that you raise is how StatsCan measures the effect of rising house prices on its measurement of inflation. And we know from previous listeners and viewers of our show will know that different countries calculate this in different ways. The Bank of Canada uses a certain way to calculate our inflation, and that inflation guides decisions on interest rates. Now, the complaint that Jen Squeeze brings up is that because of the way we can say this calculation is done, when interest rates are very low and home prices seem to explode, i.e., the cost of borrowing is very low, lots of people go into the market in Canada. We've seen this time and time again. Somehow this is not captured as accurately. When interest rates rise and that actual interest rate is then calculated into the inflation, we see it. But there is a disconnect between seeing what you might call the carrying costs of home ownership or rental
Nice.
versus the actual asset appreciation. So I think it's worth a moment on this. So
okay,
Paul,
let's get a bit wonky on this one. Okay, so first off, it's Statistics Canada that measures inflation in the country, and then we call it the Consumer Price Index, and the CPI is sort of the measure by which then the Bank of Canada is tasked to say keep inflation in check. We all know after the last many years of having higher inflation that the Bank of Canada is trying to keep the CPI at around 2%, somewhere between 1 and 3, 2% is the target. So in other words, the CPI is not just like one data point amongst many that Statistics Canada produces. I would argue it's kind of like Lord of the Ring. It's like the one ring to rule them all. It is like one of the very most important data points that Statistics Canada calculates, and it drives a huge part of our monetary policy. It's not like the Bank of Canada doesn't have many clever people who have considered many other data points, but they're mandated to try and keep the CPI at 2%. Okay, so then how do we measure the CPI? Well, the CPI looks at the value of money over time. It's looking at inflation on a range of issues, and housing is the biggest chunk of what they're looking at. If I recall, it's about 30-ish% of their overall measurement of all the things that they're looking for inflation on. But here's where it gets really, really interesting. When they're looking at whether or not home ownership is getting more or less expensive over time, you might think that they were looking at the average value of homes. They don't look at that. You might think that they were going to look at how much does one need to save, to put a down payment on an average price home in the country. That's not what they're really looking at. From the standpoint of home ownership, what they're looking at is how much interest you need to pay on whatever you've borrowed after you've put down a down payment. And so this goes to your point, Urmi, about they're looking at the interest costs that one is paying. And this matters. Like, I'm a homeowner and I've been that for 20 years. And so when I'm thinking about, okay, I still have a mortgage, it's going to come up for renewal. My cost is going to be influenced by what's happened in interest rates. And then my interest payment's going to be going up or down in the next while. But if you're trying to become a homeowner, that's only one of three considerations. And the other two are often much more important. What's the sticker price of housing these days? Has it gone up? Has it gone down? We know over the last many decades, it has gone up tremendously. Indeed, from about 2000 to early 2020s, the Canadian Real Estate Association would indicate that average home prices went up by over 300%. CPI in total is only going up by about 50%. That's a big mismatch. And at the root of that is we're not really tracking all that well what's happening with average home prices, nor as a result, how much one needs to save for a down payment. All that we're really tracking is what interest we're paying after we've taken a mortgage. And so by definition, then, when interest rates go down, we think that housing becomes more affordable. And that when interest rates rise, we think housing has become less affordable. But I can show you, and it'll be on our Gen Squeeze webpage, just plot what interest rates have done over the last several decades and what home prices have done over the last several decades. And I'm a prof, so I'm not going to say causation, but there is a strong negative association that as interest rates go down, average home prices rise. That's not surprising. Why? Because as interest rates go down, people can borrow more. And when we borrow more, going back to the first part of our conversation, regrettably, we're not borrowing to go then invest in the next big industry or technology. We're disproportionately borrowing as Canadians to go bid up the price of a home that already exists. And so, unfortunately, StatsCan then isn't picking up, oh, what's happening with that bid up average price of housing? And so then they're reporting to the Bank of Canada, hey, we're not noticing a lot of housing inflation here. Bank of Canada says we're within the 1 to 3 target of the CPI, so we can keep interest rates where they are or drop them. And then you see that vicious cycle, the lower interest rate. Let's borrow more. Let's bid up. StatsCan doesn't measure it. And that's sort of the vicious cycle of the cheap credit system. And I really, really, really worry at this moment where we've had this conversation about how with high interest rates, housing has become more unaffordable in the last few years. But I would argue that in the last few years, it's the first time in a long time we actually have seen home prices stall for a while. And from my standpoint, the sticker price of housing stalling, if only that had happened over the last 15, 20 years, we would have so much more affordability. But we lose sight of that because of the mismeasurement of housing inflation through the CPI. It's wonky. It is not going to get thousands of people on the street demanding Statistics Canada measure housing inflation better. But if we want to understand the levers in the system that perpetuate housing unaffordability and housing wealth inequality, it's right at the center.
And I think you've laid that out very well, Paul, and very clearly. Now, John, you've taken on this issue on our show several times of how Canada, we can even look at the United States, how it measures its housing impact on inflation differently. And then I know in your research, you've recently just completed your own doctorate in housing and you scanned other countries around the world. So I'm wondering what your comments are on whether there is the right way to calculate housing impact.
That's a good question. I mean, I'm not an inflation expert. I guess the one challenge is, houses are unique because, homes are both shelter and they're an asset, right? And I think the challenge is the CPI, in theory, is supposed to measure the shelter part of housing
or the consumption part, right?
Consumption
like
part.
The CPI is the consumer price index. So what we consume, which is a weird way to think about it.
Rather than the asset part and the investment part. And I think that's the challenge. I mean, most other countries like the US, I mean, what they do is they don't even care about it. They basically say, what would it cost in theory for the average homeowner to rent their home? And they use like a rental equivalence, they call it. And I don't know if it'd be that different. So I guess my question is, what's the solution then? How do we do it better? Or is there a country that is doing it better? Because I don't know if it'd be that different if we used US's approach, I guess.
Yeah, so when Gen Squeeze has been doing this part of our systems change making, I will give a nod both to the Conference Board of Canada and especially the Business Council of BC, where our colleague David Williams is their policy VP there, and he did do his PhD related to interest rate policy and housing. And so, gosh, I wish he were here now to get more, because now I understand I understand the challenge when it comes to the comparative measurement of housing inflation across countries. That's not my particular area of expertise. So I would then, in this spirit, I'd say, one, you might want to bring David Williams onto the show. Yep. Very clever guy. Two, I would say let's bring it up one level of one level of sophistication. In other words, let's not stay too deep in the weeds and say, in Canada, I think that the theoretical question about how one measures housing inflation is very interesting, very challenging. And we can say, I think, with clarity, we haven't nailed it. Because had we nailed it, we would not see such a big mismatch between home value increases and what we're saying housing inflation actually changed by. And that matters because you're right, John. housing is this unique thing. Housing is both, the shelters you said, it's also an investment strategy. It's people's major cost of living, though. If you really want to understand, value for money in our country, you have to understand how is that value of money keeping pace with our major cost of living. And I would say empirically, we have good reason to judge we haven't done that super well. What would be the solutions to that? We need to find a better way to account for some of the sticker price of housing in measuring inflation, so that right now, as we've had many drops in the interest rate. So this is going to be suggesting that housing is getting more affordable. So less housing inflation. But it's precisely drops in interest rates that everyone's expecting to help fuel price surges in the housing market. If we're not capturing that more effectively in the measurement of CPI, we give ourselves the wrong kinds of signals. The CPI is like a traffic light. We depend on the traffic light to tell us when it's green to go through the intersection, yellow to take caution, red darn well stop. But when we mismeasure housing inflation, then StatsCan is telling us to go forward through the intersection, even though house values are absolutely, climbing and causing all sorts of harm in society. And I think that's what we need to be more focused. What's our goal? Our goal for the measurement of housing inflation has to be giving a good signal about the value of money relative to our major cost of living. That just has to be the goal. And I think we can say in Canada with a certain degree of confidence right now, we haven't nailed it. And it has huge intergenerational implications. It is hurting the kids and grandchildren that we love. It is hurting them. It is harming them because it doesn't take their experience of housing into mind. They want to become homeowners, and we are only looking at one of three things that matters to them. And sure, it's the thing that matters most to us who've already become homeowners, but we love the people who care about these other two things. So let's darn well insist StatsCan cares about it too.
I think that's understandable. I think that is actually something that we should keep an eye on. Before you can benefit from the asset, you have to consume it. And if you cannot even afford to consume it, what is the point of that measurement? So I think it's a valid point, Paul.
Can I just wrap that in a nice bow? If you go to our Gen
Yes.
Squeeze Housing Solutions framework, the very top principle will be housing should be for homes first, investment second.
Yes.
It doesn't say that housing can't be an investment. It just says there needs to be a priority. And right now, in a range of ways, we're not capturing that relative balance of retaining housing for homes first, investment second. And you see that partly in the way that we measure housing inflation.
Yes, and I think you're talking to in some parts very kindred spirits here on our show, because even that idea, and we're going to get to this a bit later through some of the questions I have for you on the greater issues, even when you fit in saving for retirement, for example, the idea that a home is part of the package in Canada, paying off your home.
Mm-hmm.
And that's not necessarily the wrong thing, but there's this additional issue of it becoming more than that. And I think that's clear. I want to change a little bit.
Take us away.
To a topic that may have people marching in the streets. You're going after another sacred cow in Canada, which is this idea.
I don't know if it's marching the streets, but I do get death threats. So
do Canadians ever march in the street? I mean, they did once. But anyway, let's talk about capital gains tax and the idea that when we look at growing inequity in a society, one of the big things that all political scientists, economists look at is the transfer of wealth from one generation to the next. So the idea is inherited wealth. I think most, even capitalistic societies, tend to think should be taxed at a certain level, right? There isn't this unfettered, you gain wealth and that's it. But an interesting point is how we treat homes, right, in this equation. So in Canada, let's talk about Gen Squeeze's first saying, let's talk first about capital gains on secondary properties. And then it even says maybe primary properties, primary residences. This is the marching in the streets bit. I notice you use the word deferred taxes, but let's get to that in a second. So Let me first just mention that the Liberals have recently increased a bit the capital gains that would be charged on secondary homes or residences. Do you still think do you think that's enough? And do you think that primary residences should be something that should be subject to this tax?
Yeah, so great question. And just first, to try and slow the flow of hate mail, I just want to be clear, actually. I have never, ever, nor does Generation Squeeze actually recommend subjecting principal residences to capital gains taxation. I wish that over 50 years ago, when we started capital gains taxation in this country, we didn't exempt principal residences from it, because it created a really problematic policy incentive. The moment you shelter something from taxation, you signal, hey, that is a great way to accumulate wealth and shelter that wealth from taxation. So I'm going to prioritize that. So we literally culturally use tax policy to tell people, treat housing not just as a place to call home, but a great way to get rich. But 50 years later, trying to deal with the housing wealth inequality that has been caused in no small part by that policy incentive, I don't think starting to tax capital gains on principal residences is the best way to go forward. We have been on the record to say, look, we should have a tax shift. We should think about taxing housing wealth more and tax incomes less. But we have another mechanism to do that, and we can talk about it more. We already have annual property taxation. Our view is add progressivity to that property taxation, so that if you have, instead of having one rate for all the value of all homes, just as with income, we have higher rates as your income rises, we can have higher rates as your home values rise, whether that's a primary home or a secondary home. That would be a view that I would argue for more generally. That said, I will now start to answer your question. And your question was about the changes that the government of Canada recently made to capital gains, which continues to exempt principal residences, and they insist on that. And the politics of that makes sense. But they did change it such that if you're selling a second home, you're likely going to be paying more taxes now. And I think you're asking, what do I think about that? Well, it wasn't what we would have recommended. We did recommend, though, that they promote fairness for every generation. And the 2024 budget in which these capital gains taxes were made came in a budget that is actually titled Fairness for Every Generation. And almost everything they did in that particular budget was like, hey, we need to kind of recognize that millennials and Gen Z and those who are going to follow in their footsteps, their hard work isn't paying off like it used to. They're especially not paying off when it comes to like saving for a home, getting a home, homeownership's out of reach, and their consolation prize is lousy. It's rising rents. And so as they're thinking about, hey, we have some revenue issues in the country, how are we going to raise the revenue? They looked for ways to tax wealth more and not jack up taxes just on income. I think conceptually that does make sense. I have also been on the record saying, and here, I will annoy some people, especially in Ontario, where cottage country is a very big part of the culture. But I'm willing to stake my academic reputation on saying, in today's economy, if you own a cottage or a second home, you're not likely to be middle class anymore. You really have, merged much more into the affluent. And I know that because you can have a 30-year-old lawyer who's making six figures, who, is living in the GTA or Metro Vancouver or Hamilton or Victoria, and they're going to be struggling to find rentals with 3 bedrooms. And when, you have like the affluent young person struggling to find a 3-bedroom rental, and you have a number of people now who are owners of multiple homes, even if their incomes aren't as good as that young lawyer, you can see that class is really being changed by, the timing of one's entry into the housing market. So income matters less, your timing into the housing matters more. And so housing security is really, I think, what is such a big part of, like, do you have the middle class experience? And when you have multiple homes, you've got quite a lot of that security. If you are a renter, regardless of your income, you don't have nearly as much of that security. And so I think that as we're trying to measure people's ability to pay, to contribute to benefits that our society depends on, whether it's medical care, old age security, childcare, roads, the military, that it is appropriate for us to think about taxing wealth more, generally speaking, and thinking about taking off the pressure on income, especially for middle and lower earners.
Thanks, Paul. And John, let's go to you a bit. The idea of taxing a principal residence in Canada is, anathema,
Mhm.
but in the United States, they do. So let's maybe unpack this a little bit and how this became such a sacred cow issue here in Canada.
I mean, I'm not. I'm going to try to avoid the hate mail, like Paul. I mean, I'm not going to advocate for taxing principal residences. But it is funny in Canada. It's definitely that one tax that people feel they're entitled to. It is like from birth, if they buy a home, the tax or the gain is not taxable. And you're right, the U.S. is different. It's exempt up to I think the first 250,000. I don't even know off the top of my head. But otherwise it's taxable. And yeah, they can deduct the interest on their mortgage, but at the end of the day, it's not fully tax free. So it's definitely a cultural thing in Canada where everyone feels like, and I don't think any prime minister will ever do it because it's just going to be two-thirds of Canadians own. They're going to get killed in the next election if they tax principal residences. So I tend to agree with Paul on that.
Yeah, let me jump in there though. We do have an annual tax though on our principal residence. We call it property tax. We've all gotten used to that, and so I think it's actually inevitable that we are going to adapt annual property taxation at provincial and at federal levels, because with the aging population, we have just huge pressures on spending on medical care right now and old age security. Whether you're the Liberal government in Ottawa, the Conservative government in Ontario, the NDP government in BC, notice my nonpartisanship, you all have these mismatches between revenue and spending right now. And a lot of that mismatch is created by the failure to plan for population aging some decades ago. I can draw attention to my writing. Maybe I'll give you one of the articles for the notes for this segment so that people can see literally in the mid 1990s, governments said we were going to have this problem. They partially adapted. They didn't complete the work. And now 30 years later, we are absolutely living the problem. And so governments are going to need to find revenue. And they're going to need to find revenue in particular for an older population. And so we often feel these days in Canada that we're in a moment of scarcity. We talk a lot about unaffordability, but bringing it back to that theme of inflation and housing inflation, housing inflation has actually, in some regards, made many regular people much more wealthy. It's the one place that isn't a moment of scarcity. We get angry at grocery store owners and owners of grocery chains because they are like profiteering after rising grocery prices. Same with oil companies and at the fuel pump. But the owners of housing aren't really companies. Disproportionately, the owners of housing are kind of regular Canadians for the most part. And so the inflation there has made them better off. And given that, there is a moment for us to say, we have been to some degree printing wealth through our housing system. If we need revenue for an older demographic, and the older demographic has disproportionately benefited from rising home values, I do think it is inevitable in the years ahead, we will look for ways to try and find that tool. Right now, we live in a cultural context where politics has sort of devolved to, in order for you to vote for me, I'm going to offer you more stuff, and we are never going to talk about how to pay for it. In fact, if anything, I'm going to offer you a tax cut. But that is not a way to actually manage the budget any longer. And I know some people are going to say, but if we cut taxes, Paul, we'll spur the economy. But actually, when you have an aging population, as we do right now, and that's driving most of the spending, it's also reducing the revenue we can collect because there's fewer people in the working population. We have a higher proportion of people out of the labor market. And when you do that, all the economics research is clear. You're going to reduce productivity levels, which will then have a downward pressure on the revenue we will gain. And so we're going to need to find a revenue source, including for the long-term care that many of our loved ones are going to require going forward. And I think the wealth that exists in people's homes is going to be a bigger part of that revenue conversation.
Paul, you've done something. You preempted my next question. I was going to kind of subtly accuse you of just doing the same old, saying property taxes need to go up, but these are controlled at the local and at municipal levels. But you said something really interesting, which is, and my question to you was going to be, because that's one of the two sort of overarching issues the generation squeeze does mention, is the issue of governance in Canada over housing, because we're a federal nation, a federation that has multiple layers of government. I think your other issue was about not having enough data collected on these things. I know John would definitely agree. So, uh, but going back to this idea, it's very interesting for you to say that the federal government and provincial government may start to make a play on property taxes. I was going to ask you whether you thought they should step in and start having a firmer hand on that issue. Because, and I say that because in Toronto, just for context, we are notorious for having quite low property taxes relative to even the suburbs around us, including the suburb just to the north that I grew up in. Largely, taxation rates there are higher. Of course, people say it's nicer, it's greener. The slogan of Richmond Hill is a little north, a little nicer. But I'll tell you, it's not. It's the property tax rate if you have that point of view.
Yeah, and if you look at in Vancouver proper, there they'll have some of the lowest mill rates in the entire country. So if you have $1 million home in Vancouver and you have $1 million home in Prince Edward Island, you'll be paying. Well, I did the calculation. I think it's like 10 times more in Prince Edward Island, maybe even more. Again, people should fact check that. I'm sort of conveying the order of magnitude rather than the precise stat. It won't make sense for us to add progressivity to property taxation administered at the municipal level, because then you're going to create a whole bunch of inefficiencies at the boundaries of a bunch of towns and cities. It will make much more sense to do so at the provincial level and or at the federal level. And I would encourage both. You should know in British Columbia that we do have progressivity on annual property tax, which kicks in at the housing value of around $3 million. So it's very, very few homes that actually, reach that level and face that added progressivity. I think the big conversation is like dropping that to 2 million, to 1.5 million, and modest rates, but adding a bit of modest progressivity at sort of the $1 million-1.5 million range can actually collect a decent amount of revenue, and do so in a way that we don't put someone who's home rich but cash poor in jeopardy. And we already have very, a range of policies that allow seniors in particular to say they can defer their property tax payments until their home is sold. I think if we're going to add more progressivity, property taxation generally for, regardless of one's age, you'd still want that deferral process in there, just to protect against that experience of being, I have quite a lot of affluence in my asset, but I'm on a relatively fixed income. So there's easy ways for us to get around that. And then that kind of goes more to Urmi's kind of opening question or observation just about inheritance. We have to recognize that right now we are creating a society where one's attachment to an older Canadian homeowner really is driving one's ability to hack our broken housing system or to continue to suffer into it. Because we do know this conversation about the quote unquote bank of mom and dad, or the bank of grandma and grandpa helping their heirs out before they pass away. And in some regards, it's a lovely moment of intergenerational solidarity. And I love the love that happens around family tables. But we need to recognize that, there's about a 30% of people who aren't going to be attached to an older homeowner. And not everyone, if they're in Fredericton, that's not the same sort of asset accumulation that you have in Hamilton. And so there's a bunch of inequalities that are unfolding that we're going to need public policy to address. And so we need to bring that intergenerational love from our family tables into the policy tables of the world of politics. And that's really the mission of Generation Squeeze.
I'm loving that. Expanding the love. I don't know how you're making like more taxes sound so lovely, but it's working. Paul, before we move on to the wider agenda of looking at the whole suite of the Social Security network and how it works for generations, I had one more question around the housing piece. Now, one part of the Generation Squeezes platform is around the idea of zoning, and I don't think this is new to any viewer or listener to this program. We're seeing moves by BC on the provincial level. In Toronto, we saw it on the municipal level. This idea of promoting densification through changes to zoning. One thing I found interesting and I thought was a bit of a tension is on the one hand, the generation squeeze does acknowledge that the only real answer, and I think Olivia Chow, Mayor of Toronto, would agree to this and has been talking about this, to really solving the housing problem is massive transfers from the federal and provincial government financially. And to my mind, I've always thought, the social transfers that we do in education and in healthcare, I've always thought, do we need another leg? And that's housing, the traditional massive sort of the scaffolding of how Canada operates as a
Yeah, so
federation.
so we have a Canada Health Transfer, CHT, the Canada Social Transfer, CST, which does a lot of education. You're saying let's have a Canada Housing Transfer. We'll have to have a different acronym. It can't be CHT as well, but yeah,
Yes.
I take your point. Got it.
But
Okay.
I've always thought, maybe it's
Interesting.
time because of the issues that we have. But my point is, because otherwise, in the absence of that, we know there's wrangling over who should get that 1% more off gas tax for infrastructure, or there's a lot of wrangling over how municipalities and local governments get access to that. But at the same token, your generation squeeze also says local communities and Indigenous communities, local meaning municipal, should have more power over building the kinds of housing they'd want. Now, I wonder if that funding
Interesting.
gets transferred without any rules around it, do we not actually go back into that Canadian problem of jurisdictional warfare or NIMBYism, or what you were calling inefficiencies at the municipal boundaries? So I
Wow.
just
Okay.
wondered about that tension there.
Urmi, that's no one's. I don't go into many interviews these days where I get a new question, but this isn't. No one's ever asked me that question before. So kudos to you for just like really thinking through the details of the complex housing solutions framework we put forward. I can say with clarity that we feel strongly at Generation Squeeze that it is important for both the federal and provincial governments to use their investments in both housing and other infrastructure to incentivize municipalities to add density in land already zoned for residences. Full stop. And so you see the accelerator fund being used federally, and we have long encouraged that very use. I wish they'd done it earlier. Effectively saying, hey, municipality, you want the biggest share of federal funds, then add density. Because that then allows the local politician to better handle the NIMBYism. The local politician is is more at risk electorally to that, the resistance to change in a neighborhood. And the way in which the political boundaries work provincially and federally is not the same level of local risk that way. So we need the politicians who can, manage the risk in a way that's to take it on. So good on the accelerator fund. We know that Mr. Polyev has a similar idea. He doesn't like the accelerator fund, but his concept is almost identical. So I like that. I like that in BC we have, as of right now, effectively all land zoned for residents can have 4 units. This will reduce the time it takes to get stuff built. And I think that is part of the solution. The one thing I would just add, and it brings it back to the conversation with taxation, the moment we change zoning to permit more density, we just made the land more valuable. And so we have to recognize that as a society, when we're changing zoning, we literally we're printing money. And the question becomes, who is going to collect that value? Right now, we tend to actually say, we're going to make developers really manage this issue. And so we're going to collect most of the value from zoning changes from developers, and say, developers, you're going to have to do your development cost charges, and you're going to have to do your amenities payments and whatnot. And so then the developer's like, fine, we'll pay that, but we're just going to add those costs to the sticker price of anything new we buy, which then means the young person or the newcomer of any age is going to then be paying that cost when all the neighbors around also got the land lift and have more value in their property. And I would argue that we want to be spreading out the collection of that land lift to everybody in the neighborhood who's bought it, and you can make it a smaller collection there, but then you don't have so much pressure on the developer to be having to incur all these additional taxes, which they then just pass on in the sale of the new build. And I think that could actually also help pave the way to getting new stuff built at a better price point, because others who are benefiting from the land lift are, contributing a share of that land lift back to the public good. So
that's fair. And it's actually it's a flip side of what we were hearing last week, which is a lot of the time the public doesn't benefit from the land lift. that we all can collectively contribute to or participate from. This is another way. So again, we're returning to this idea of broad-based taxation measures versus more targeted ones, which we've heard about. I think that's all actually fair and very interesting, Paul. And now I think one of the most interesting parts of Jen Squeeze's agenda, which we're leaving to the end only because we're housing focused, is this idea of looking at the broader sort of suite of programs that, let's say, the older generation benefits from. So OAS, old age security, and other types of programs like that in Canada, when combined with housing wealth, the argument I think from Jen Squeeze is that it's further resulting in a gap between generations. And this touches on something that I think John has also been thinking and writing about,
Maybe John and I need to hang out more.
which is this idea that in the 80s and 90s, Canada did embark on this, quite how much they stated it, they definitely thought about it, push to have citizens start contributing to their own retirement through a couple of vehicles. One is the home fine and home ownership, which in Canada has always been pretty high, but the idea to keep that as a characteristic of our society, but also the RSP and other ways in which you can, as a private citizen, put money away for your retirement. And it's beneficially taxed at the point at which you're doing so that it incentivizes you to do it. All well and good. But something seems to have happened along the way where we are now at a point where a lot of programs are only income tested. They are not asset tested in Canada. So yes, certain programs, if you make a certain amount, you're not eligible for OAS, but that doesn't always take into account income. And one thing John was noticing is that even disability programs, which are for people that are really facing the biggest hardship, often have a harder means test on both your income and your assets to see if you can pay, if you could contribute to your own upkeep. So it's interesting that this divide happened. And I guess my last question is for both of you as to your thoughts on why it seemed Canada embarked on this. So a bit different from the European model. We're not going to give you all your pension money, which has its own issues. You're going to save a bit and we're going to help you. But then sort of at the end didn't seem to finish the job and say, okay, now when you reach retirement, we're going to test to see your total of your income and your assets together. Why did that happen? Or
John,
what was,
why don't you go first?
yeah.
Oh my God.
How did we seem to get into this cultural area? I guess I'm wondering.
I mean, I'm no expert on the welfare state, but I mean, certainly, I think Urmi's point is right. And I did think this kind of really kicked off in Canada in the 80s, 90s, where the government had no money. They're kind of broke effectively. I mean, if we remember under Chrétien, they're in a debt crisis. And certainly home ownership rates actually surged from, I think, low 60s to high 60s in a relatively short period of time. And certainly when we think about, this idea of the welfare state, the idea is like, it's not when we hear welfare, we think, helping people who just can't support themselves. And that's not what we're talking about. We're talking about the government.
It's not social assistance.
Not social assistance. This is about, government's concerned about people being able to maintain their lifestyle and income and everything throughout life cycles and economic cycles. And certainly retirement is one of them. And as Urmi said, certainly owning your home was a big part of that. If you own your home in retirement, you have no housing costs other than property taxes. So I don't have the answer. I'm kind of curious how, I mean, and Urmi's question is a good one. Canada has this system that relies on our own personal assets and retirements, but kind of ignores our personal assets for things like old age security. And I know, Paul, you've written about old age security and how younger generations, I think recently, are contributing so much more than previous generations. And it's hard to wrap our heads around why that's still going on now.
Yeah, well, I know we're running out of time. So one, I'd like to make a pitch to come back for another interview. Let's do it again, not so long from now. Two, there's a really interesting literature by a scholar in Europe named Peter Van Husse, Vanhusse. And he will look at a bunch of affluent countries and ask, have we set up public policy to work as Robin Hood or as a piggy bank over our lives to spread our savings out or spread our assets out? And he would answer disproportionately that Western countries are not really Robin Hood, taking from the rich and giving to the poor. They're much more about spreading our resources over our lives so that, when we get into retirement, we can maintain a standard of living. And I think we definitely have that being the case here in Canada. If you look at our old age security system, I just wrote this most recent week in the Globe and Mail about a lovely couple described in the Globe and Mail's financial facelift. And they were, being coached on how to manage their resources. And by their own explanation, they would have over $200,000 in annual income. That would include a little over $20,000 from the Canada Pension Plan. And what I focused on was the $19,000 from old age security. And the thing about old age security is like the Canada Pension Plan was fixed some decades ago so that what you contribute over your working life is relatively in proportion to what you will draw down. And then I think people mistakenly believe it's the same for old age security, and that is just complete nonsense. Old age security is just a subsidy paid to the people who are entitled at the time. And we created it at a moment when, actually old age security is, but I think in the 1950s. And at the time you qualified for it at around age 70, and average life expectancy was 72. If you flash forward to today, you qualify for old age security at 65, and we all know that average life expectancy has gone into the mid 80s. And if you hit 65, you're you're really likely to be living into your 90s now. So, the challenge is that when we created old age security, at the time we had this baby boom. We called the boomers a boom for a reason. They were just numerically large. And so there were about 7 young baby boomers to pay for every retiree in the mid 1970s when baby boomers came of age as young adults. But if you flash forward now to when boomers retire and have every reason to expect the same, if not better, services and benefits, including medical care, there are only 3 working age people to cover every retiree. And that change in the ratio of working age people relative to retirees is a massive systems change for which it was entirely predictable. We called them a boom for a reason. We knew this boom was going to be young, and eventually the boom would work out to be older. And we chose not to plan for it adequately. And that is what's gripping Mr. Trudeau in Ottawa, Mr. Ford in Ontario, and Mr. Eby in BC, all running large deficits when we're not in a recession. And we desperately need to plan for that now. We need to figure out, if we didn't do it several decades ago, how do we fix the problem? Better late than never. And that's going to take a longer conversation than we have time for now to address. But I hope your listeners recognize there's a distinction between saying boomers screwed up and saying governments didn't plan adequately for the healthy retirement of boomers. And I'm saying the latter. Boomers have benefited from that, and it's going to come at the cost of their kids and grandchildren, who I've already shown are paying 20 to 40% more already toward the old age security and medical care for boomers than boomers paid as young people to the seniors in their day. And it's only that extra tax burden falling on their kids and for income tax is only going to grow larger as we approach peak population aging. We need to address that issue, not in a judgmental way, not in a way that people feel defensive, but to say, I, as an older person, want a healthy retirement, and I want to leave a legacy of which I can be proud, and I don't want to leave unpaid bills unnecessarily to my kids and grandchildren. If we can start there, we can absolutely fix this problem. And then to Urmi's point, the place of housing is going to intersect with these other policy issues, because housing is this asset that we don't tend to measure when thinking about evaluating our ability to pay towards medical care, towards the income supports we need as young and old people. And I think it's going to just have to come in and become a bigger part of the equation. We're not set up administratively at the bureaucratic level to do that very well. It's going to take an investment to make that possible. So it's going to take a bit of time, but I think it's going to become necessary. And I hope, as you can hear, as we're winding down, I'm going to trying to channel my softer voice and just say, hey, you older folks out there who do have financial security in terms of you feel decently housed, and you're looking ahead to are you going to be Elon Musk? Maybe not, but do you have security? And then kind of look do your kids and grandkids have that same kind of security? And if your answer is sometimes no, then like that's the moment of grandmotherly love I want to tap into. And can we harness, grandambassadors on behalf of their kids and grandchildren to use their vote in the next federal and provincial elections, not only to cast a vote for a healthy retirement for their generation, but also healthy investments in housing and childcare and post-secondary and deficit reduction on behalf of their kids and grandchildren. And that will make us be a Canada that works for all generations.
I don't think we
What a
can
way
do
to
better
wrap
than
up.
that. Oh, it's brilliant. Brand ambassador. Well, Paul, we really enjoyed this conversation, and not to be tribal about it, but as a fellow political scientist, you brought the fire. And we often accuse our economist colleagues that we really value as well, John and all of his colleagues, as not having the political solutions to put this into plan. But you brought some, dare I say, controversial and very interesting viewpoints for us to think about. So I really appreciate this conversation. I'm definitely open to a next one. John, any closing thoughts?
Yeah, no, thanks again for joining us and for bringing the fire and the passion. Always a great discussion.
Thank you so much to both of you. And if we do come back, let's focus on what I think really is the cultural thing we have to tease open right now. Whether we're talking OAS or housing, we really are asking a younger demographic right now to some degree, sacrifice their standard of living to protect those who've come before. You think about how we wouldn't want home prices to fall that much because that would harm people's nest eggs. And so we say, hey, younger folks, you suck up higher housing costs to protect other people's nest eggs. I think that protection is a reasonable thing to expect. But if for those who are being protected, I really want to ask, what do we owe in compensation? And I think that's the cultural conversation that we don't have enough of. I didn't know exactly what to expect from today's show, but I think this is exactly the right kind of trio of people to start teasing that apart. And I would love to participate more.
That's great.
Yep, it's Canadian Charter of Rights and Responsibilities.
There you have it. Oh, gosh. Wow. We're just nailing it today.
We're just outdoing each other with the political scientism, but I love it. Thank you so much, Paul. Thank you to all our viewers and listeners. You can send us your comments. As Paul mentioned, we will include the show notes and the links that were mentioned. The links in our show notes that were mentioned. You can always reach our show at Move Smartly on X Twitter. John is at John Pasalis. And Paul, where can listeners reach you?
At Jen Squeeze, GENSQUEEZE, at Jen Squeeze, jensqueeze.ca, or paul.kershaw@ubc.ca.
Beautiful.
Excellent. We'll keep the conversation going. Thank you, everyone.